Hey everyone, ever since talking about the Morero Chronicle and Morero Crystal dungeon crawlers and proclaiming my admiration for them, people have been asking me in the comments what I think of the Mary Skelter games. And after taking a look, I can see why. They're both dungeon crawlers. In fact, it looks like they're built on the same game engine, if that's the right term to use. What I found interesting is that some people strongly prefer Mary Skelter over the Genkai Toki games, so I was curious to give the series a try. Idea Factory sent me the limited edition of Mary Skelter Finale. That's the Switch version, by the way. And because Finale is the third game in the series, I asked Idea Factory for the previous games too, so that I can get a good overview of the series. This video is going to be a review of the third game, as well as its limited edition. But when it's relevant, I'll throw in info about the earlier games too. Because there's things going on about the Mary Skelter storyline that warrant some advice, let's say, when it comes to what order to play each game in. I'm going to start with the basic summary of what the series is about, and then I'll warn you as I start talking about the premise of Mary Skelter Finale, as we can't really talk about that game without spoiling something from the first two games. Mary Skelter takes place in a dystopian world with humans in danger of dying out. The world used to be normal until a giant hole swallowed up what the game describes as one of Japan's busiest cities. It's usually almost always Tokyo, isn't it? I'm gonna assume it's that. In that hole is now some crazy-looking environment where creatures called Martians reside. In the center is a large, grotesque-looking tower called the Jail. Martians keep humans captive in there and subject them to all sorts of torture. A human settlement does exist called the Liberated District. It's a sort of last stand for humanity. By the way, it looks like the Hong Kong walled city that used to exist, doesn't it? Certainly seems that they pulled inspiration from there. Operating within the Liberated District is Dawn Liberation Force, whose aim is to escape the jail. In order to fight the Martians, the Dawn utilizes blood maidens who are girls with the power to fight the Martians. The world overall is quite grim. The game doesn't really throw gore in your face though. It's more like that they play with the tone using, dialogue and, to be fair, a heavy dose of screaming from the voice actors on occasion. The order in which the games are supposed to be played is interesting. You should start with Mary Skelter 2, then Mary Skelter Nightmares, and then Mary Skelter Finale. Mary Skelter 1 and 2 are like alternate versions of each other, but the order is important. It's a bit weird because I feel Mary Skelter 1 is much better when it comes to world building and giving you a good, amount of background knowledge of the setting. The second game kind of throws you in comparison. And there's a part at the beginning of the second game which has more impact if you've played the first game first. It's an interesting dynamic those two games have. I myself started with the first game, unknowing of the fact that I got the order wrong. I was already several hours in when I found out while doing some research that I should have started with the second game. The first game starts off with Jack and Alice in the living jail, and then getting rescued by a blood maiden called Red Riding Hood. By the way, you'll notice many names are based on fairy tales and folklore characters. There's a reason for that, by the way. Anyway, as they escape the jail, it's revealed that Alice is a blood maiden herself. Blood maidens basically get powered up if they get splattered by Martian blood. The problem is that corruption levels can build up, and they then go into something called Blood Skelter, where they just go out of control and attack everyone. This was considered a terminal condition until it's discovered that blood youths exist, which is what Jack is. His blood can be sprayed onto the girls, which removes any corruption level. A specific gun called the Mary Gun is made, which allows controlled usage of a blood youth's blood. Yeah, there's a lot of blood in these games, and it's being utilized in ways that is definitely unique to the series as far as I can tell. I think someone had a fetish of some sorts, like a blood fetish or something, and then they decided to build a game around it. At least, that's my theory. The second game starts off vaguely familiar, but we see things from the Blood Maiden's perspective right at the beginning. And there's also a couple more characters present, mainly Otsu and Little Mermaid. Despite being the game we should start with, there isn't much world building going on, and I really actually appreciate having played the first game for a few hours first. After the jail escape, events play out very differently compared to the first game, and it's clear that the story isn't just a rehash of the first game. In fact, it reinforces how important the other characters are to the overall story right at the beginning, whereas the beginning of the first game feels very much Jack and Alice focused. It is possible to watch all the cutscenes of the first two games in Mary Skelter Finale, so if you're interested in the series, you could technically skip the previous games. But there's no voiceovers, which I think is really unfortunate. Not to mention, I don't think there will be many people who would want to read hours and hours of cutscenes before getting into the actual game, just to be greeted by more cutscenes. Mary Skelter is certainly very plot-heavy, and it uses cutscenes as a medium to convey its story, so yes. Prepare to read a lot, or not, when, if you have it set to English. The third game is where the results of both storylines of the first two games come together, so this is the time to stop watching if you don't want any spoilers. Mary Skelter Finale starts off after the true ending of Mary Skelter Nightmares. The story is split between various groups, so you'll experience even the early events from different people's perspectives. The protagonists make it to the surface wondering what to expect, but unfortunately, it's more of the same as they are met with mountains of corpses, which isn't exactly ideal. Actually, it's worse than before, as they spot a huge jail that is much bigger than the one they had to deal with before. It's all looking rather bleak, and things only get worse as Massacre Pink is introduced. A group of 4 girls who appear to want to kill everyone except for Alice, who they want alive for some reason. The earlier mentioned piles of bodies seem to be their doing, and as if that isn't unsettling enough, it also seems that they take great joy in killing, as each member of Massacre Pink has their favorite way of causing their victims misery and suffering before ultimately killing them. Our protagonists are hopelessly outclassed when they try to defend themselves and seem to face certain death, but Hikari uses her powers to teleport everyone away, which saves them but also splits the group apart. This is where things get interesting and we get introduced to some new characters. For example, an unnamed boy who has amnesia and only knows that he needs to find his wife. Curiously, he seems to be a blood youth with a Mary gun, and he also has a bit of a difficult personality, let's say. Then there's Mary and Charlotte, both of whom are blood maidens who were not part of Dawn. Charlotte is notable for A, sporting massive underboob, and B, mysteriously having a lot of knowledge about other protagonists even though they don't know her. Another interesting addition to our group of protagonists is Pyre? Oh geez, I forgot how to pronounce that actually, even though I heard the name in the cutscenes. Yeah, but she's actually one of the members of Massacre Pink. In the beginning cutscenes, it's shown that she's the only member who didn't end up killing anyone, as she can't really bring herself to do so. I think I'll leave it at that when it comes to the story. I think it's really interesting to follow, and I like the various, perhaps unexpected character interactions that occur as characters find themselves in the company of others who they are unfamiliar with. The gameplay basics are easy to wrap your head around. If you've played previous Mary Skelter games, then you know exactly what to expect. And in fact, I don't think you even need to follow most of the, or maybe any of the tutorials. And also, anybody coming from the Morero Chronicle and Morero Crystal games will find this all very familiar too. It's a first-person dungeon crawling experience. You move around on a grid-based dungeon, or grid-based dungeons, with several floors. The higher you go, the more difficult the enemies become. For the most part, enemy encounters happen randomly, though occasionally there are opponents at specific places, be it for event and story purposes, or just part of the dungeon. Battle is turn-based, there's regular attacks, special attacks, an elemental system, and you can use items too, so nothing unusual for JRPG fans so far. Where things get a bit more unique compared to other RPGs is when it's the leader's turn. The leader can't fight for him or herself, but rather acts as a support role. Mary Skelter veterans will know that this is where you can shoot the blood maidens with blood in order to keep them from going into Blood Skelter mode. You can also use items during this turn, or protect a blood maiden from damage, for example. So it's a good idea to always be mindful of the turn order and plan ahead your moves. Especially because you need to manage the leader's blood, who can KO themselves if you don't recharge their blood. As the girls defeat Martians, they get splattered by Martian blood. Once the splatter gauge fills up, the girls go into massacre mode. In this state, they can do a lot of damage for a short amount of time. They also gain some unique high-power skills you can use in battle. If not purified with the Mary gun, then Blood Maidens will go into Blood Skelter instead and go berserk, like I just mentioned earlier, attacking enemies and your own party randomly. You can see how dark the blood icon thing gets. So basically, if the gauge is black, then, you either purify or it's Blood Skelter time. A somewhat strange gameplay mechanic, if you're new to the series, is licking. Instead of purifying the Blood Maidens, you can also have characters lick other characters. Which, by the way, doesn't really have any special animation, just in case you're wondering. But licking gives them buffs and regenerative abilities. Basically, it's like a defensive version of Massacre mode, kind of. As you navigate the dungeon, you'll be faced with obstacles you have to get by with correct timing, or sometimes you'll have to utilize the girl's unique abilities to proceed, like being able to pull objects magnetically towards you or bombs to blow up walls, for example. Nightmares still navigate the dungeons like in earlier games. It is worth mentioning that the PS4 version looks different when a nightmare follows you. Everything becomes basically pitch black and there's no red line to indicate the radius of the nightmare's reach. It just gradually fades and becomes brighter as you approach that line. So in the PS4 version, it looks like it's considerably easier to get lost accidentally while being chased. I thought that was an interesting and quite substantial difference between the two games there, graphically speaking. Something I find quite good is how this game differentiates itself from the first and second game. Not only does it do that in terms of storyline, but also gameplay. As the characters are split up, you can choose between the various groups as you play. But the interesting part here is that groups will often find themselves in the same dungeon, so if you can't continue because of a locked door or something, it is possible to switch to a different group in the same dungeon and find, let's say, a switch which will grant the first group the ability to continue. I think that's a great way to feel more connected to the storyline. If it was just done in a way where you play through each group sequentially, I don't think that would be as fun. Plus, you get to choose which group to play, so you've got a bit of say when it comes to the order of things. And if you ever get frustrated or stuck, you can switch to another group before returning with a clear head and trying again. There's been a handful of times where I was just staring at the map and I couldn't find any unexplored path whatsoever. But when I got back to it, I found it right away, so yeah, I guess sometimes you just have to step away from it. And this gameplay mechanic allows you to do that quite organically, if you want to use that word. In a way, the party switching also expands on the whole interconnected dungeons thing. In the previous games, I didn't think much of the dungeons being connected. Like, does it matter that they're linked together really? You've got a menu to select everything, right? But if you have characters spread out like that, it's different. It's kind of exciting to see bits of dungeon explored by another group on the minimap. There is a better perception of the scale of the world. And it also breaks up a lot of this repetitive base camp dungeon dynamic that can happen in a lot of RPGs. Something that can be a bit confusing is when you need to give other parties items. There's a sort of Dropbox system where you can give other parties items and equipment. It's not just a convenience thing though, as there are items you will need to exchange to progress. For example, keys. The thing is, you'll need to keep track of the unopenable doors and which key or item they need to be unlocked. So sometimes it's like, you are not quite sure what you need to do to progress, and then you realize, oh, it's okay, I have to just transfer this item over there, and then you have to run around all over the place to get to the Dropbox and back to the door. So yeah, there is that. Most of the usual gameplay functions from previous games exist in Finale. As characters level up, you'll unlock jobs, which specialize a character towards certain fighting styles or support roles. I'll admit I usually select jobs that I think have good outfits, unless it really changes stats to my disliking. Some of the outfits are more ecchi than others. Actually, the default outfits aren't that fanservice-y at all, with the exception of Charlotte's massive underboob, but the jobs can change that a bit. Other previous gameplay functions you'll see again is blood farming, side quests, and all those various ways to make your character stronger, like upgrading equipment, blood devolution, which lowers levels and increases base stats like reincarnation does in Disgaea, and skill creation also, to name a few. I think at this point I don't need to explain too much here, since people playing this game will have played the other games. I will say though that I don't find myself using too many of these mechanics. Usually I just equip and upgrade weapons and armor, and if I find myself too weak, I'll just grind for a bit, and in only a short amount of time you go from being almost killed on your first battle in a new dungeon to being able to explore almost half a floor without even thinking of warping back to base. But I guess that's the point of these things. You can kind of pick and choose which route to take when it comes to making a party stronger. I should mention I'm playing on normal difficulty. There's also easy and hard, so that should accommodate a lot of people's preferences. There's also the, that room decorating stuff and gift giving from the last two games. One thing you may be wondering about is, where is the purge minigame? And I thought that myself when I was playing. The first two games had a quite infamous loot-rubbing minigame to purge the Blood Maidens from corruption when you're at base camp. It's very similar to the Genkai Toki games, but it seems that in Finale, this ecchi minigame is no more. I was surprised not to find it as I was playing, so I did a bit of research online, just to see if I was missing anything. Strangely, the reviews I looked at seemed to mention neither the presence or the lack of the minigame. Surely that's quite a big omission if the previous two games had it, right? Eventually I found some comments on forums and Reddit posts that mentioned the Purge minigame being absent in every version of Finale, so yeah, both the Switch and the PS4, Japanese and Western. So I guess this is one of those instances where Sony didn't let the game mode fly, so it was just removed from every version so that they can say, that all the versions are the same. Remember, Mary Skelter 2 didn't come out on the PS4, so maybe they were worried about losing that market share with the new games, so, out that minigame went. Another change in Finale is that a handful of Blood Skelter designs are slightly tweaked to be a little less revealing, but these changes are so small, it's like, why bother in the first place? It's just a couple of pixels, so it's like, I find it a bit strange that a company would, be that specific about something like that. Let's talk about graphics and performance. I've got the Switch version, and if you've played the Mary Skelter 1 and 2 games on it, then expect a similar experience in this game too. There are some differences though, the biggest one being that cutscene sprites are a higher resolution. In the first two games you can tell how low the resolution is. In Finale the sprites look nice and high res, and so do all of the menus. I think that's a pretty good improvement. In terms of graphics in the dungeons, I think it's basically more of the same. Some dungeons look better than others, with a few unfortunately looking very flat or primitive. Like that early one that's all yellow and gold, that one's particularly awful. But overall, I guess dungeon crawlers are a little bit forgiving when it comes to crummy graphics. It's not really something that hampers enjoyment too much. The game runs at 60 FPS, at least it tries to most of the time, but you'll notice that number decreasing pretty frequently when moving around. Since it's a dungeon crawler, I don't mind too much, but it's certainly not that great considering the simplistic graphics. I've seen some PS4 footage and it's noticeably better on that system, as you might imagine. Things like menus look great though. I really like the Mary Skelter art style in general. There's a high contrast look going on. Hair highlights are usually pure white, for example, and shadows are pure black. Dark and highly saturated colors are also used. I think it looks great. You can choose between English and Japanese voiceovers. Usually when I record reviews, I start with English, then switch to Japanese, just so I have footage of both. But then I get used to the Japanese and leave it that way. At least that's what happens most of the time, and that's true here as well. Of course, it's nice that you get the choice. In terms of translation, I can't say how accurate it is exactly because I can't speak Japanese, but I've noticed that the game opts to not translate honorifics. Honestly, I always think that ends up being awkward when a character calls another character, One-chan, for example, and then it gets translated to sister something or the other way around. In Japanese it would be normal, but translated into English it always sounds unnatural. Especially if they aren't sisters. That's a common thing in Japan, but that isn't really that common here. I think I spotted the word sissy being used once, which instantly reminded me of the whole railgun/index translation with Kuroko, which is like, ugh, anyways. So yeah, I'm not a huge fan of that, even though it's usually common practice. I just think it makes things awkward, since honorifics are used in ways which aren't translatable or can't be localized into another language properly. Like the whole thing of, using one's last name and then adding san to the end, which by the way isn't really a problem here too much with this game, but I'm just saying in general. Having the last name and then san at the end is something that's quite normal when you're speaking to somebody in high school, but then it gets translated to Mr. something or other. And it's just so weird because high schoolers don't talk like that with each other. It's like, you don't use your last name and, Mr. last name. Like, what the hell is that? Anyways, I guess I'll just start talking about something else now because there's other things to talk about. I quite like the music in this series. It fits, well enough for the most part. For cutscenes, there's also a range of styles of music to fit whatever the situation is. Something about the dungeon music that's a bit annoying is how it restarts every single time something happens. Whether it's just a short fight or a small interruption of some sort, it starts right back in the beginning when you get back to roaming in the dungeon. It's needlessly repetitive on the ear holes. It's interesting that some of the sound effects are the same on some other games I've played. Like, I noticed a few things when going through the menus that remind me of the Neptunia games, or some things sound pretty much the same. And of course, there's also the Morero Chronicle and Crystal sounds that are shared among the games here, so there's a few very recognizable sounds there. Mainly it's all, menu and navigation effects, so not really a big deal. Let's take a look at the Mary Skelter Finale Limited Edition now. There's two versions, a Switch and PS4 version. As I said, mine's the Switch one. The only difference is the game itself, and the steelbook is different in order to accommodate either a disc or a tasty cartridge. There's three things here: the game itself, the limited edition box. Yes, the game isn't inside the box. And lastly, we have a 3-volume box set of the light novel. I like the look of Mary Skelter in general, like I mentioned earlier, and I think it's all very well highlighted here. Let's look at the game first. It's pretty standard for a Switch game, so, nothing too weird or fancy stuff going on here. I think the cover art looks great. I like the black and red look. I'm always a fan of tilting an image or other design elements. It adds a sense of movement to the design. Not an uncommon technique, but it's effective. The inside has only the game, no manual, something I'm saying quite often these days with both games and cars, unfortunately. The outside cover design is the same on the inside, except the barcode isn't there for some reason. I think they could have at least tried to throw in a cool design for the inside. I don't think they're lacking in terms of usable art and illustrations they've got available, right? The limited edition box looks very nice, but it does kind of remind me of the various Disgaea illustrations we've seen over the years. It's all strangely familiar looking as a longtime Disgaea fan. By the way, UPS attacked my parcel mercilessly before delivering me the corpse of the shipping box. Somehow, through some sort of miracle, everything survived unscathed, with only a small crease on the back of the box being a reminder of the terrors the LE had inflicted upon it. The inside of the box cover has a bit of a wraparound design, which is nice. The various groups you switch between in-game are represented on the side panels of the bottom part of the box. For some reason, I got 2 trading cards. One came together with the game case, like it was wrapped in the same bit of bubble wrap, and the other was actually in the limited edition box, so not sure what that's about. It's a beach-themed illustration. There's a very shiny poster of the LE box cover art. The creases are a little bit too pronounced, which I don't like. Nothing on the back, in case you're wondering. The level dividers that are common in Neptunia games are here too, holding everything in place. Next up is a steel game case. I quite like the limited use of colors and the brushed metal look. It's cool how the front has a yellowish theme and the back it's purple. The inside shows all the Blood Maidens. This looks too small for a CD, so I guess the PS4 version must be bigger. Under that, we've got the soundtrack. It's a soundtrack of all 3 games. Yes, there's 3 CDs in here, which is very cool. I think the music is pretty good. I already spoke about that a little bit. Unfortunately, everything is mastered according to the laws of the loudness war. Very squashed and not very dynamic. Not unexpected, but always disappointing. Each disc has the title image of each game, so it's easily identifiable. I think that's a good design choice. Then there's the art book, which is hardcover. I like how the look has been mixed up a little bit. There's actually a lot of white on the cover. The duotone elements are nice looking too, or actually I think it might be monotone / monochrome effect that we're seeing here, since it's only one color. Well, but then again, it's anyways, I think you know what I mean. The inside has the usual character profiles, illustrations, and concept art. There's even an interview bit, which I always think is great because that can reveal some of the thinking behind various design choices. Now we have the novels. It's a box set. The transparent sleeve is a very nice touch. When you pull it off, it reveals the full color versions of the pictures. And again, like with the soundtrack, we have each volume with its specific game's title image. I'm not going to flip through them too much because I don't want to, show spoilers there. There are images, so I suppose these are technically light novels. The illustrations can be quite grim, befitting to the game's setting. The books reveal lore and backstory on a number of characters, so definitely a nice thing for people who follow the plot closely. I noticed the paper isn't the usual matte sort of affair, but rather something shiny like an art book. I guess it's for the sake of the color images. So yeah, it's slightly unusual compared to other novels. But yeah, that's the Mary Skelter Finale limited edition for the Switch. Overall, I really like what it comes with and how everything looks. There's lots to display when you put it on the shelf, though I do wish the game case was actually housed in the LE box. And it's not just gimmicky stuff either. I mean, 3 novels is pretty hardcore, compared to a bunch of stickers or maybe some trading cards. It's not something you see often with other limited editions. So, in the end, Mary Skelter Finale is a great dungeon crawler with an immersive story, interesting world and characters, decently challenging difficulty, and an overall refined gameplay feel. I like the changes that they made to this game to make it feel different to the previous 2, especially with the split party gameplay. And despite suffering from some performance problems there, it doesn't detract too much from the overall experience. I like being able to play it around the house, for like grinding purposes, and the dungeon crawling nature of the game makes the graphical shortcomings not feel like such a big deal. I really liked my experience with the Mary Skelter series. I think the strongest point is the story. For me, it was the main drive to keep playing. I wanted to see what would happen next. That's true not just with Finale, but the other 2 games. As someone who played both Morero Chronicle and Morero Crystal, I was pleasantly surprised how different both franchises feel. One has a lighthearted look and lots of in-your-face ecchi, which is a lot of fun, while the other has an involved and dark story. They kind of each have their place. I feel like you play each game for a different reason. It's just too bad that the Purge minigame has been omitted for the last game of the Mary Skelter series. So, I hope you liked the video and found it helpful. Let me know what you think of Mary Skelter Finale. If you want to support the channel, consider becoming a supporter on patreon.com/yzen. You get to see videos early and get updates on what I'm working on. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you again in the next video.